Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out tonight to hear this fascinating talk on the final findings of the excavation of the Neva Survivors Camp. You came here to hear of a very accomplished man in the world of archaeology and another person from the Alaska Native community who's been an integral part of our excavation too, and that's Bob Sam. So he'll speak a little bit, and David McMahan will. So without further ado, Mr. McMahan.
All right, thanks, Hal. Before I get started, I just wanted to plug an event that's happening tomorrow night at the Larkspur Cafe between 6 and 7 p.m. Zhenya Anachenko, Brennan Carter, and myself will be there, just sort of leading an informal discussion on Sitka's submerged history, Sitka maritime history, you know, southeast shipwrecks and so forth. So if you have a chance, come on by. Well, as far as the Neva project goes, it's been an adventure. You know, it's been a long road since we started in 2012, and went out to the site with Bob Medinger and Jay Kinsman, and quite frankly, we didn't think we'd find anything. You know, it was a chance to get out on the water, and you know, so we were really surprised when we went out in 2012 and found what we believed to be the survivor camp.
A little hard to hear you.
Okay, let me. Okay, is that better? Says it's too loud, I guess. Okay. Well, this is the story of the Neva. You know, it's sort of an epic story of survival. Hit the right button here. Oh, there we go. And I did a talk last year and sort of updated on what we had found in 2015. Since that time, we've done another field season and found some pretty interesting things. And I know a lot of you were probably at the last talk over at the university. How many of you? Just show of hands. Yeah, a lot. But I want to make you sit through the rehashing of a lot of the history because I think it's important to establish context for the wreck. Around here, the Neva is known mostly for her participation in the Battle of Sitka in 1804. But she was involved with the first Russian round-the-world voyages between 1803 and 1806, and you can see that there's a list of notable accomplishments. I won't go through all that. But her last voyage happened in 1812, 1813. One of the interesting stories, local stories, is that the icon of Saint Michael in the church is said to have washed up 30 days after the wreck, basically undamaged. When the Neva set sail for her final voyage, it was in August 1812. And there was a lot of discussion leading up to that time as to whether she would go to Japan on an emissary mission or go to Alaska in support of the colonies. And the Russian-American company eventually won out, and she ended up going to Alaska. But by that time, it was late in the season. The effort was just fraught with problems. You know, the naval officer who was supposed to have commanded the ship drowned just a few days before they were to set out, so they had to come up with someone else, and there was infighting, so then they had to swap again, and it ended up under the command of Lieutenant Padushkin. So they set off, and they were going to go on the north side of the Aleutian chain and then cut through the pass, but they just got pounded by winds, so they ended up on the outside of the Aleutian chain, south of the Aleutian chain. They're never able to get in to get water as they had planned. The rigging was damaged, they had to repair it, and they just got blown all around the Gulf. And finally, in November of 2012, they ended up in Prince William Sound. And by that time, probably 14 or 15 people had already died at sea. And they were trying to decide whether to make for Sitka or to try to winter in the Sound. But given the weakened condition that they were in and what they knew of other expeditions that had to winter in the Sound, they decided to make for Sitka. And they almost made it. You know, they had a rough start and got blown all around the Gulf, but they finally made it to within sight of Mount Edgecombe, and the weather had improved. And they felt that they would be in Sitka the next morning, so the skipper went down, who was Mr. Callanan. Padushkin had to step down because he couldn't cut it, so he turned the command of the ship over to a civilian. At any rate, Mr. Callanan went down below to get a little sleep, and next thing you know, the ship's going in the opposite direction from what it was supposed to be. At that time, it was best to approach from the Sound from the south, but they ended up approaching from the north. They had to, coming from the Sound, and the winds were sort of shifty. So at any rate, they ended up going in the wrong direction, and somebody cried, there's land beneath the bow. So they immediately threw out the anchor, but it hadn't been secured properly on the windlass, so it just spun out. So at that point, they ran on the rocks. They were there for quite a few hours. They tried launching a boat with the women and children, and it immediately capsized. So they tried making a raft out of yard arms and whatever they could find, and that immediately was broken apart. So the ones that were left just sort of gathered on the bow or gathered on the stern as the ship broke apart. And after a few hours, the stern was lost too. So they were grabbing whatever they could to make it into shore. We don't have a complete list of the crew and passengers that were on the ship. Unfortunately, the official records were probably lost. At least we haven't found any. And what we're left with are a few survivor accounts, 4 to be specific. And those are the names that are mentioned in one of the survivor accounts of people that were on board. And these are people that they would have considered important enough to mention. Probably a lot of the common sailors, they were not mentioned, and a lot of them may have been Creoles or natives in the service of the company. But I highlighted a couple. The one at the top, Borovalikov was supposed to have taken Burnoff's place in Sitka. And then the other one that's highlighted was was a Sitka Clinket, and he was taken to St. Petersburg as a boy and sent to school to study shipbuilding. And he was returning to Sitka as an apprentice shipbuilder and was one of the folks that died in the wreck. So don't try to do the math on this, but there were approximately, depending on which account you read, there were 77 or so people on board when she departed Okoks. 13, some accounts say 15, I think, died at sea. 32 died during the shipwreck, and then 2 others died on the beach. From the description, it sounds like they died of hypothermia. So that left 26 survivors. And they were on the beach for 24 days, constructing shelter from whatever they could find or what washed up from the ship. One of the interesting things for me is, the Neva is one of those legendary shipwrecks, and if you've been around historic shipwrecks a lot and dealt with them, every one of them was carrying treasure, and the Neva was no exception, and there are all these stories, about all the payroll that was on board and the treasure and so forth. But I think a lot of it's just the lore of the sea. We may never know what exactly was on board, but we know she was carrying a lot of axes. But in 1915, there was a big flurry of news all around the Pacific Northwest. You know, there were all these articles about this salvage diver, Stager, that was going to salvage the Neva. And Stager's the same guy that salvaged the Clear Nevada off Eldred Rock and other wrecks around southeast Alaska. He liked being in the news, you know, and for the time, he was sort of the salvage guy. But anyway, they just sort of stopped, you know, and nothing else. And he's the kind of guy that if he had actually done something, it would have been in the newspaper. So I think what this is a bunch of, sort of like modern treasure hunters, you know, they build up a bunch of hype and then try to get investors on board. And I suspect it was a similar kind of thing, but it's sort of interesting. So, you know, like I said, I went out with Bob Medinger and Jay Kinsman in 2012, in June, the lowest tide of the year, and that's me in the dry suit. But I thought our best bet to find something would just be to look on the beach rather than try to do underwater work. It's a really difficult area to work underwater in because of the thick kelp and the currents and the surge and so forth. So we went out, and it's such a high energy area. We didn't really find much on the beach, but we'd done our homework, you know, we'd done overflights and looked at aerial photography. We knew what the tides were like in 1813. We knew what the rate of uplift. You know, we'd interviewed those, we read all the survivor accounts, so we pretty much narrowed down where we thought the wreck was. And then we asked ourselves, you know, given their weakened state, where would they have set up their survivors camp? And we went there with a metal detector and found 2 caches of Russian axes. Russian axes are distinctive because they have that little barb in front of the handle, and it's a trait that sort of evolved in medieval times and became stylized and lasted on up well into the 20th century. And only Russian axes have that. So we knew immediately that it was a Russian site. We suspected it was the survivors camp, and we also felt that it was important enough that we should stop and not disturb it any further until we had funding and support to go back out and do it right. So in January 2013, 200th anniversary of the wreck, we applied for encouraging the Bob Medinger. I did a proposal and applied for National Science Foundation funding. And we eventually received that funding. And it was too late in the year to do anything in 2013. So we initially planned to start work in 2014, but because of the, you know, it became apparent that we were going to have to take longer to plan and consult, get all the permits in order and that kind of stuff. So we spent our first field season out there in 2015. But in between, we tried to do a marine magnetometer survey. Unfortunately, there's so much iron in the rock and the lava flows from Mount Edgecombe that it masks the signal. You know, normally you use a marine magnetometer to pick up cannons and anchors and things like that. But out in that area, you can swim around underwater with a handheld metal detector, and the boulders are just like cannonballs, some of them, you know. So it's pretty worthless. And also in the meantime, Zhenya and I did some archival work, mostly Zhenya, both in St. Petersburg and in London, looking in various archives. And we did find some interesting things. In the London Register of Foreign Shipping, we found the most detailed account. It gives a lot of information about the Neva. She was surveyed a couple of times. you know, she was originally the Thames, built in London, and she was surveyed when she was built in 1800, and I think she was surveyed again in 1803. So we have a lot of detailed information. And interestingly, there was a little note in the margin that said she was sold to foreigners in 1803, and we know that that's when Lizzie Ansky purchased the Neva, you know, for the first round-the-world voyages. So, yeah, I won't go through all this, but one of the details that we were able to sort out was who built her, and it was a fellow named Peter Mestar, and he had a shipyard at Rotherhithe called the King and Queen Yards, or King and Queen Docks. Rotherhithe had a lot of shipyards. It was the same place that the Mayflower was built. And Peter Mestar primarily built ships for the East India Company, but he's also known to have built ships for the British Navy. He's a very well-known shipbuilder at the time, a very wealthy guy. He had a lot of real estate holdings around London and even owned a pub near his shipyard. We know that the first owner was a fellow named Robert Taylor of Crutchet Friars in London. Crutchet Friars is sort of a financial district, and he and his partners had an office there. And this is probably the same Robert Taylor who in the 1790s was involved with the slave trade. So just some of the details. I won't go through all this, and I know those of you that heard the talk last year, a lot of it's repeated. But I did feel that this was a pretty interesting piece of art. It's at the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. It's done in 1792, but it shows what the yards at Rotherhithe looked like at that time. And Mestar's yard is at the far right. It just catches the edge of it. At least that's what the maritime historians believe in London. So in 2015, we set out. I was fortunate enough to have a really good crew. Some of the folks are here that have been involved with the project: Virginia and Chinko, Brendan Carter, David Lubin, Sue Thorson somewhere. I'm sure I'm missing somebody. But we had Canadians, we had Russians, you know, we had Americans. And everyone had their little niche and expertise, and it just meshed really well. So it turned out to be a really good mix of folks. We excavated a number of one-by-one units, some of them in blocks. And you can see the two blocks in the lower part of the slide. That's the area that we believe to be the survivor camp. And then there's a creek to the north of there. And then when we did test excavations up here in the north, we actually found that there's a Tlingit hunting camp there that dates from the mid to late 19th century. And that helped explain some of the later artifacts that we were perplexed over. And I think you've probably seen this published or previous talks, but this is just a sampling of the artifacts that we found in 2015. Gun flints, pieces of copper sheathing that they were using to make things out of, a buckle, nails. Some of the copper nails had been shorn off from the wreck. And then this thing, which is the lead of a nautical divider. Additional axes, musket balls. Some of them had been whittled down to fit into a smaller caliber weapon. Pieces of copper rod that had been cut into little short pieces, possibly to fire out of a weapon. Some of the things were just iron concretions, and we x-rayed a number of them just to see what was there. Nothing super interesting in the x-rays, mostly nails, but there was a little iron ring and I think there was part of the spoon. And some of the items were so corroded that we had to put them through electrolysis just to sort of see what was there. And then a little fish hook that was probably made out of a copper nail. And the items on the right side of the screen, you see the pocket knife and then a marked pipe stem fragment. It took us a while to date those, in particular the pipe stem. We thought that we were sure we could date it, but we just couldn't find anything in the literature. But a year later, one of our participants, Daniel Thompson, was able to identify it. And it's a type that was sold by the Hudson Bay Company, and it dates from the later part of the 19th century. So we know now these came from an intrusive hearth that cut into the earlier deposits, and we know now that these date from the same age as that Clinton hunting camp that's nearby. And this is the hunting camp, and the thing that looks like a rock in the upper right of the pit, that's actually a big section of iron kettle that's turned upside down, and it was full of deer bone. And then the types of cartridges we found there, dated it later. We've got the rim 44 cartridge and 4570 centerfire. We've had faunal analysis done on about 2,900 specimens. This chart is from the 2015 work. I just got a comprehensive report on the 2016 materials. It sort of combines everything, but I haven't put it into a slide yet. A lot of deer, but there were other animals too. And this last time there were a number of beaver bones, which is sort of interesting because they're not said to have been on cruise off until pretty late. So we went back in 2016, and again we had a outstanding crew. We had a couple of new people, and then some of the veterans from 2015. We had our Canadian mappers and Americans and Russians. So this is just sort of an overview of what the area looks like along that outer coast. We actually brought a drone and 2 drone operators out there in 2016. One of our participants has his own company to do drone work, but he's Canadian and he wasn't licensed at that time to fly in U.S. airspace. So we had to bring a guy in from Anchorage to fly the drone, and then Sean operated the camera. It's a beautiful area. I think the first time, we went out there in May, Brennan was along, there were 6 or 7 bears on the beach, right where we planned to camp. One of the primary tools that we use, we used a series of metal detectors. We had probably a half dozen metal detectors on site designed for various uses. And one of our participants, Daniel Thompson, is sort of an expert in metal detecting, both in prospecting and archaeological metal detecting. So he led the metal detecting effort. All these flags are objects in the hunting camp area, which was near where our work camp was. And we didn't excavate all these, but we flagged them and marked them. And then we began finding things. And the first thing we found, which is the next little cove over from the survivor camp, is we found copper sheathing that was stacked. There were 4 pieces of copper ship sheathing that had been sort of crumpled and stacked, and it was caching behavior. They were collecting this stuff from the wreck or wreck site where it washed up, and they were dragging it up probably to the upper edge of the beach and caching it for future use. Because of the uplift, it's now in the fringe area, above the beach, but at the time it probably would have been the upper part of the beach. But they're square nail holes where it was attached to the ship. At the bottom of the stack was an iron object, which I'll show you shortly. But see the tree in the upper part of the slide? Someone was walking by there one day. Was it you, Brennan? Somebody was walking by the tree and saw an iron object. I think it was Sean. But anyway, it turned out to be a piece of ship's hardware. And it makes sense, that stuff would be up high like that. So, she wasn't in the sea, she was in the tree. And we did try to ascertain, we know that there's been about 11 feet of uplift since 1813, but we cored a lot of the larger trees to see if we could ascertain just when trees started growing on that terrace. And it looks like probably around the mid-19th century. But you can see where the arrow is. That's where this eroded out. And this is what we believe to be a yard brace. Probably would have been maybe used as part of the topsail. You can see up to the upper right, there's something very similar. This hanging down. So the copper sheathing and this yard brace is really the first conclusive evidence that we have of the ship. So we're very happy to find that. And this is sort of a 3D rendition of the yard brace. We were lucky in that we had a couple folks that were willing to do these little animations and had the software to do it. And it involves, you can see in this photo, it involves taking dozens and dozens of photographs and then using very expensive software to stitch everything together and turn them into animations. It's an example of some of the Russian axes. I failed to mention that the yard brace was right on top of the axe, so it's conclusively Russian. And then there was another cache of Russian axes nearby. So that's what I meant when I said, well, we know that Neva was carrying axes. So we probably got a couple dozen axes from the site so far. And then a large iron drift pin. This was actually between some boulders in the intertidal zone, but it's consistent with what one would expect for a fastener from that period that would fasten the keel to the keelson. And then the iron object beneath the copper sheathing that I mentioned is in the upper right, and it was a bundle. It took quite a bit of cleaning. It was basically completely corroded over. But what this is a bundle of iron bar stock, such as they would have carried on ships for repairs. And it was bound with a piece of spruce root cord. And this was found, this had washed out of the beach scarp in the survivor camp area. It's about 2.5, 3 centimeters long, but it's a scabbard tip. such as would have been found on the scabbard for a dirk or a naval dagger, something of that sort. This style was pretty common. The only one we found so far that matches this identically is an example that metal detector is found on a colonial site back east, but we don't have any details on the age or anything. And then lastly, you know, these things always happen within the last few days of the project. And in this case, we're probably fortunate that it did happen in the last few days. But there was one area that we wanted to test because we've noted hearth material and burned animal bone washing out of the beach cart. So we felt like there was another hearth there. And keep in mind that these 26 survivors would not have fit around one hearth, you know, plus this is a very stratified society, so they probably were broken down into messes, you know, and they probably had, you know, a few people, they probably had a whole series of hearths along the shore. So we were thinking this was another one of those hearths. So we excavated, and once we got the organics and topsoil off, then there was a depression. But the depression also had hearth material and calcined animal bone in it. So it was a little bit puzzling. So we continued to excavate. And what this turned out to be was a grave. And we excavated just far enough that we could ascertain that it was a coffin burial. You know, the wood had completely decayed. And let's see if I can pause this. No, it's not going to let me. But you can see the dark stain, I think, in the bottom of it. But the rectangular stain was oriented east, and there were mismatched nails or fasteners around the edge on it. So there's no doubt in our mind that it was a coffin burial. At that point, we consulted with the tribe and with Forest Service, and we backfilled the pit. You know, we didn't excavate any further than that, so we didn't disturb the grave. But it's interesting because in the survivor accounts, they mention that they gathered up the bodies that they could and buried them, but they also say that there were only 2 intact bodies. And one of those was one of Olikoff, Baranoff's intended replacement. And certainly he would have been considered high enough stature to warrant spending the extra time to build a coffin. So it's possible that this is his grave. You know, we'll probably never know for sure. So to close out the project, we had a Chuck Miller with permission from the elders, led a clinking drum ceremony, and then Deacon Herman and Anna Ditmar led a Russian Orthodox service at the site. And at this point, I'll let Bob talk. Hopefully I didn't ramble too long.
This seems like the same group of people that was at the university 2 years ago. Same faces. It's an honor to be here tonight. Quite honestly, I thought I was going to do this tomorrow night because tonight is council meeting for me. So they graciously allowed me to leave for a short time to do this presentation. Many of you know my name is Bob Sam. I was born and raised here in Sitka, Alaska, and fortunately I've had opportunities to be around some of these places when I was very young. And I recall going out there as a very young teenager and being fascinated by the outside of Cruzoff Island. A couple of years ago, I was very vocal about how I felt about this particular project. Many of you know that I've been involved with preserving cemeteries and grave sites. And when I first heard about this project, my initial feeling about it was to try to convince people to leave it alone. Shipwrecks, in particular, military shipwrecks, are seen as cemeteries today in America. And the Neva is a very famous shipwreck with human remains that have gone down with the ship. There are military ships on the coast of California and other places that are protected because they have human remains on them and they are seen as military deaths and that they are protected by law. And I see this particular ship, the Neva, in the same way. And rather than just continually complain to council or complain to Historical Society, fortunately I was selected to actually go out to the site and meet the people out there. Then I would have the right to complain. So, 2 years ago, I was invited by Dave and the Historical Society to actually go out to the site and to see the work being done out there. And they really treated me very well. In fact, they eat very well out there. Oftentimes they have steak on the evening I was there. But also, there was a number of bear out there, and there was a whale carcass on the beach. So there was more bear activity during that time. And so I was a little bit concerned and nervous about that. And it was my first time to be exposed to the electric fence that surrounded the camp. So I was very impressed that that little fence can keep out a bear. And also I was able to watch and meet the people that were working on this project. I have to say, they were very, very professional people working out there. Dave and the crew were very highly professional people, and in a matter of one day, I trusted every single one of them. And I believed that if they found any human remains, they would do the right thing and contact the tribe and the city, which they did. So I became very comfortable working with them. Getting back to the site, on the outside of Cruzoff Island, as many of you know, growing up here and fishing here in Sitka, on the outside of Cruzoff Island It's not your normal place. In fact, it can be a very dangerous place for even boats with motors. It's a place where there's a lot of natural phenomena occurring there. The local people, the Tlingit people, have known this for as long as they have been here. There are a number of sites out there where there were human remains located in caves very close by to where the campsite is located. I was very concerned about those caves, but I found out that back in the 70s, most of those human remains have been taken out and taken someplace else. Those remains were of mummies, of what we call shamans or and also it's an origin site of what we call the halibut hook. Many of you know what the halibut hook looks like, made out of wood and spike. That's the site on the outside of Cruzoff Island that this halibut hook was developed. And there are a number of really well-known shaman detailed accounts of shamans going out to the outside of Cruzoff Island and getting out of the canoe, and their body would sink out on the outside of Cruzoff Island. And when they came back to town, the shaman was always found in the forest, in the trees. So the Cruzoff Island really was a very, very special place to the Tlingit people of Sitka. Much of that information is gone. Back in 1838, there was a smallpox epidemic here in Sitka, or all over the world, where 90% of the Tlingit people died in that epidemic. What that means is all the information, everything, all the old culture disappeared in 1838 smallpox epidemic. And very little information survived from that time. What survived was very few people who were able to pass down this information down to the future generations. Tlingit people are very intelligent, and they pass down information by word of mouth to generation. And they're very, very well versed in oral traditions, so I have to tell you, we're very smart. You might think we're quiet people, but we are very smart, and we love our culture, we love our history. There are some survivors among us who survived those shipwrecks, who were taken in by the Tlingit people, and they were adopted. So there are some Tlingit people who have no idea that they have no Tlingit blood at all. They are full-blooded Russian people. And they look just like Russian people today. And there are descendants walking among us who believe they are full Tlingit. But they became one of us. And we don't treat them any different than we treat anyone else. Essentially, we just made human beings out of them. We gave them identity, and we gave them a place to live. Some were taken to Klawak and grew up down there, and we know who they are today. I'm very honored to be here tonight to talk with you. Many of you I know, and my goal here in Sitka is to bring the Tlingit community together with you so that we can understand each other and come together as a community. And Sitka is the place to do it right. And Sitka is a place for the Tlingits to preserve their history, preserve their culture, preserve their in such a way that you would enjoy us more than you ever have before, and we will enjoy you just as much. So thank you for this short time. Thank you very much.
All right, I'd like to open it up to questions for Dave and Bob. So, where did Dave go? There he is.
Dave, what's next?
Well, I don't know, it was sort of a long road to get to where we are, and we've got a lot of information that has to be written up, and we're still involved with analysis. We've got one person sort of working on the collection part-time right now, so it's taking time. We're sending some of the copper sheathing to a specialist in London, a archaeometallurgist that specializes in copper ship's metals, and then some will be sent to Coy Cooper at Purdue University as well. So we're trying to get a handle on metallurgy. One of the things that this guy in London is doing is he's trying to establish a timeline for the chemistry of ship's copper, during. And one of the things he's doing is he's analyzing the copper in dated Russian copper coins. Granted, some of them are mined in different areas, and I'm not sure how he's handling that. But it's a starting point anyway to try to build sort of a timeline so we can take copper fragments. For example, at Castle Hill, we found a lot of copper sheathing, and may be able to help us date that. So we're doing that. We have a lot of data from the faunal analysis that we're trying to put together. We're trying to tease out the layers. It was a fairly complicated site. I mean, the overall picture is one of survival, but we did have later intrusive materials from that hunting camp. Even on the survivor camp, there was a later hearth that had been cut into the earlier deposits, but it wasn't real clear, except for the later artifacts that were found. So we're trying to look at the stratigraphy and tease out the layers and use that to analyze the fauna and let the artifacts tell the story.
I have a question for Mr. Sam. Wondering if there's oral history stories that have been handed down about the wreck through the Tlingit.
The Neva was a hated ship, even up to today. And shamanism existed during the time of Neva. And there were people around during that time that had power. And they hated that ship so much. It's no wonder from the very moment that ship left Russia, it was doomed the moment it left the country. It had nothing but hard luck all the way across. Some of the local people were not surprised about that at all. They believed that they used their power to bring that ship to wreck on the outside of Cruzal Island. And it was doomed. And being out there, and I'm sure you've been out there yourself, it has this energy out there of something happened there. So my short time that I was there, I did a little ceremony with the crew that was there, and had a little conversation because there was so much death that happened there that I asked the spirits to go leave, and I did it in a way that asked for peace and for us to move on with our life. And I felt closure because the local people made peace in 2004. And so going out to there to the site, I felt closure that after so many hundreds of years of the Neva, it's time to put some closure to that, all that pain. And so for those bodies to have peace. So I'm really glad Chuck and the church was out there as well. And the Neva is still a four-letter word to some of the native community here today. But I think that's changing as well. So let's continue with that change and learn from what happened to that ship so that we can go on with our life. Thank you.
I usually preface the talk with saying that the Neva's either famous or infamous, depending on your perspective. But, we come here to bury Caesar, not to praise him.
I have a question for Mr. Sam as well. You mentioned that local people made peace in 2004. Could you elaborate on that?
2004, there was a totem pole raised out at the port site commemorating the 200-year anniversary of the battle of 1804. And clans came to Sitka, the clan leaders came, we raised the pole, and we made our peace with Russia. It was technically, we never had a peace ceremony with Russia, a formal peace ceremony, and we felt that after 200 years, we were still technically at war with Russia. So we had Al Perkins commissioned a totem pole to be placed out there in the middle of the fort site, and we invited people, the whole community and people all over Alaska, and some people from Russia came, and we had a peace ceremony. And also the peace hat came back to Sitka and was presented to the local clan. So we actually had a formal peace ceremony with Russia after 200 years. And some of you were there.
Can you also mention the story of how they were found, the survivors at the survivor camp?
Well, like I said, we just have some translated survivor accounts. The official records have been lost, and 3 of the survivor accounts are pretty much on par, but a 4th one is quite different. Some of the details differ, but the most detailed account says that 2 Permishleniki were sent in opposite directions, and one of them encountered a native boy in a canoe and offered to buy him a shirt if he would take him to Sitka to get help. So he went to Sitka, and Baranov dispatched boats to go and rescue the survivors. And we know that also in the months that followed, he sent boats to salvage whatever they could from the beach.
The land rise in 200 years you mentioned was 11 feet. How do you arrive at that?
I got the information from the NOAA scientists, and I can't tell you the details about how they arrived, how they calculated the uplift. And I suspect that it's a regional estimate rather than a local estimate, so it could have been a little less out there or a little more. But, just based on what we've seen, there's probably at least a couple meters, if not more. I guess my gut feelings that 11 feet maybe is a little bit too much, but this is the data that was presented to us by the NOAA scientists. I will say that the artifacts that we found in the survival were on a beach surface, and that area has risen and supports old growth trees now, and we think that probably happened in the mid 19th century, just based on tree rings and stuff like that. So, I'm not sure I answered your question, but that's what I have.
Is the site protected? I mean, people are not permitted to be in that area, I presume.
Well, it's federal property, so there are laws against disturbance of the site under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act and other laws. It's a very difficult area to get to. The whole outer coast is fairly remote. The weather really has to be good to be able to get into shore out there. So I think that helps protect it. And also, the site is eroding very badly, and I doubt that there's much left, to be honest. I think most of it has eroded away, and probably a little bit, but it'd take a lot of luck to find additional materials.
How many different digging areas did you have, and how much area did the whole site encompass?
Well, the survivor camp area was on a narrow little terrace because most of it has eroded away. Probably at the narrowest point, maybe 10 or 15 feet wide, and the widest, you know, is sort of irregular because of the erosion. The widest point, maybe 50 feet. And on that terrace, we opened up maybe, can't remember exactly, but maybe 15 or 20 1-meter units. And then we looked in some additional areas in 2016. You know, there was that hunting camp that I mentioned, and we excavated a 1-meter by 2-meter unit there. And then we opened up some smaller units that were mostly driven by metal detector hits, where we recovered the copper sheathing and ship's parts.
I've just got a quick question. I don't remember if you said it, but that little, it looked like the top, like a cap, a copper cap or something on a flagpole or something. It was rounded and it kind of came more to a point. What was that actually from? Do you know?
Looked like a finial.
Yeah,
that was
yes.
rotating. Yeah, that was the tip from a scabbard, like for a dagger.
Okay, that's what, okay.
And it was they're pretty common throughout the 19th century. You know, they had little ornate things like that for scabbard tips.
You said that there was a statue of Saint Michael that came up 30
Well,
years
there's an
later?
icon of Archangel Michael in the church.
Is that made of wood?
The icon, I don't know, can you answer that, Gina?
Yeah, the icon itself is made of wood. Sometimes icons of Russian American company were on canvas. This one is wooden. What's mysterious for me is it came with Lisa, which is kind of a silver tree covered with the icon, which is silver. So it had to be transported. The image itself is
I have a question. Did you mention how you found that spot? Had you been looking for it for a long time, or like what made you narrow down to that area?
Well, you know, we did our homework ahead of time, so we had, of course, read all the survivor accounts and looked at aerial photos, and we even did our own overflight. You know, we had the information on the tide, so we were looking from the uplift, so we were looking at rocks that might have been related to the wreck and so forth. And in compiling all that, it sort of matched up with an area where we thought the wreck had probably occurred. And then we ran across an article in a little newsletter published here in Sitka in 1990, I think it was. And a fellow had been diving for abalone out there and said that he observed a camp, and it just happened to coincide with the area that we had pinpointed. And we didn't find it. You know, we've tried to do underwater work out there, but it's tough. You know, it seems like we're always plagued by weather or compressor problems. You know, the kelp's really thick. The surge, you know, sends you back and forth. So it's you really have to pick your days and you know, just dig down through the kelp. Jay and Brennan can attest to that. It's sort of hard. It's a difficult area.
You mentioned that the Russian axe heads have an extra little spike on them.
Mm-hmm.
What's the purpose of that spike?
Well, folks have debated that, you know, whether it was to protect the handle or to pull nails. I don't see how you could really pull a nail with it. I mean, my best guess would be that it was initially to protect the handle, but it was a style that was developed in medieval times, and I think it became sort of a stylistic trait. And some of them may still serve the function of protecting the handle, but I think some of them are just stylistic. It's just a style that evolved through time in Russia, Estonia, and that area, and on up into the 20th century.
Where are the artifacts going to end up?
The artifacts are property of the National, the U.S. Forest Service, And they have an agreement with the University Museum in Fairbanks to curate their archaeological collections. So that will be the permanent repository. It's, Fairbanks. It's actually, I see some of you rolling your eyes, but it's actually not that strange, because there are not very many museums in Alaska that can accept archaeological collections. Most of the smaller museums, they don't want a lot of broken rocks and glass, they want things that they can display. So by having an accredited museum like that take care of all this stuff, then the smaller museums can obtain the things that they want to display on loan, and they don't have to worry about taking care of, 100 boxes of broken glass like what we have from Castle Hill.
Here's a question for Sam. What was being that it's so far out there, what was the purpose of the hunting camp? It seemed, far from Sitka. Was there another purpose to going farther out there? Just sticking close to here?
Actually, those days, everybody was really spread out. And the people here were seal hunters. And so many people lived out in those areas. Yeah. Crusoe Island was quite a community up until statehood. Most everybody lived out there.
And I would just add that, when we did that excavation, just about all the bone, or the vast majority of it from that area, were deer bone. And when we turned over that iron kettle frame, it was full of burned deer bones.
So a story from a kayaker who had gone off the coast there, that at one time there was a Russian cross, a tall Russian cross mounted on the shore. Have you heard about that? Or
I haven't heard that one. Would you like to hear more about it?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Steph has seen it.
Yeah, I saw that cross years ago on one of those really rugged beaches out there. I remember clearly because that beach was covered with little pumice rocks, that floated on the tide.
Yeah.
What was it made of? Because, what was it made of? Because
There was a wooden Russian cross, in the traditional.
5 feet, 6 feet, how big?
Yeah, it might have been 5 feet tall. It
There's
painted
one on the
white.
south side, across from this area.
So kind of doing some research on the Neva in the past, I came across the Stager articles and the Captain Sales coming up here to do the salvage. And they quoted a figure of $200,000 of church vestments on board. Is there any idea of where they got these numbers, or is it just made up, you think?
I don't know where they got them. I haven't run across anything like that. Have you, Janya?
No, but don't you think it may be related to the icon? It's a beautiful icon and the cathedral's been there for a long time. So it's easy to see how that would kind of grow. Ship must have been filled with those silver after.
It wouldn't be sent alone, it would have been a company.
It's a fashion statement.
Sure.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this talk. Our next one is May 3rd. That's Father Michael Alexa on the Six Saints of Sitka. If you've never heard Father Alexa speak, you're in for a real treat. Make sure you put that one on your list. So, see you May 3rd, and thank you very much.
Dave, Bob. See you next May 3rd.